a pleasure to be here today, and I'm very excited to speak with today's guest, Karen Hartman. Hartman is a remarkable playwright who has produced a head-spinning body of work that's been produced all over the country over the past 3 decades. She's a graduate of Yale and the Yale School of Drama and a Guggenheim Fellow. She's written a huge number of plays and written op-ed page pieces for the New York Times and the Washington Post and other places. Yet it wasn't until this year, when she was 51, that Karen's work got a substantial New York showing, when 3 of her plays were produced simultaneously by Volt, a new festival from 59 East 59. The subject matter, hugely diverse. The Lucky Star, which was great, and I had a chance to see, was based on a trove of real letters written by a Polish Jewish family in the early years of World War II. And then Goldie, Max, and Milk, about the unlikely bond between a queer single mother and an Orthodox Jewish lactation consultant in Brooklyn. And New Golden Age, a dystopian thriller about 2 sisters trying to connect in the brave new world Hartman imagines. I've been looking forward to getting a peek inside this very active imagination. Welcome to At Lunch. So Hartman, you have a fascinating personal history as well as an admirable career. Let's start at the beginning. I've read that you started writing plays as a teenager, at a time when people your age were more likely to want to write screenplays or television shows or be a rock star. Where did this passion come from?
Oh, that's a beautiful question. There was something just kind of logical in my brain where I had wanted to be an actress from maybe ages 3 to 8. And then I wanted to write books from maybe ages 8 to 12. And then when I was 12, I started reading plays. Like I read Tennessee Williams plays, I read Arthur Miller's plays, I read Our Town, and I thought, oh, this is what you do if you want to be both, if you want to be a writer, but you like the theater. So I kind of put together in my brain, even though I hadn't really seen plays, and but there's something about theater that you can make even when you're a little kid. You could be in a play. It's very accessible in a way. So it seemed natural. Little did I know.
That's really great. But then I think I read that you got you were in some kind of playwriting program in high school or something that sort of launched you. What was that about? I'm really interested in that because I think of kids, trying to figure out, it's always interesting, like what's the thing, right, that sparks somebody. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So for me, I grew up in San Diego, so there wasn't a lot of, it was not like a cultural powerhouse, especially at that time. But this woman, Deborah Salzer, who had been an actor and a teacher in New York, moved to California, and she started a California version of the New York Playwrights Festival that she called the California Young Playwrights Festival. And I just auditioned for it when I was like 13 or 14 and got to be in the first year, which was a play by an 8th grader. And then I wrote a play about mothers and daughters and submitted it, and I got to have my play produced. And so it was sort of like crack. I mean, it was a very mainline high experience to have things that were so important to me broadcast so loud. I felt like I really had a voice, and at the same time that I could give voices to other people. So yeah, Deb Salzer is one of my closest friends to this day.
Wow.
And also that festival just gave this enormous boost of confidence, I guess, and experience.
It's amazing. What was that play about, the mothers and daughters one?
It was called In My Mother's House, and it was 6 different scenes that I called vignettes, so it's more elegant, that were 6 different mother-daughter relationships. And I'm thinking about it now because I'm trying to write about my mom again and thinking that started out. That's why I got into this. So yeah.
It's really great. I mean, for me, what you do is so remarkable because, I guess we all have our way of imagining the world and thinking about it. And so, I've written books, but mostly nonfiction and some fiction, but it's very different than what you do because, well, the same in many ways, but what's so different is that your words are then inhabited by people who become this 3D living thing. And to me, that's so incredible and scary. So I really had, to be a teenager and to even think about doing that is so, maybe that's the best way to start because you're brave and not thinking so. But so continuing on the theme of mothers and family, I mean, you have very interesting family background. And I wonder if you could just tell people a little bit about how your parents and grandparents and anybody else influenced your work, either directly or indirectly.
That's a great question. And also one I've been thinking about. My grandparents were immigrants. 3 out of 4 of my grandparents were immigrants. They didn't finish high school. My parents grew up in Cincinnati, and my mom became a teacher, my dad became a doctor. They both lived at home, went to University of Cincinnati. And in their different ways, I guess, did everything that they were supposed to do. And I think I could spend the whole time on my parents, but in different ways, I think they each had an artist in them, maybe, that was not allowed to be part of how they lived their lives. So they moved to California and they got divorced. And so by the late 70s, I grew up in those 2 households that were really pretty different. And my mom was very aesthetic. She wound up selling real estate. And my dad with a deep soul, a really connected person and a deep thinker and a really good communicator. So the arts weren't part of our lives per se, but I'm the oldest of 4 siblings and we all became artists.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
Yeah. So, 2 musicians and 2 writer. I'm a writer. My sister's a writer performer. So something was going on,
Wow, that's pretty
Yeah.
incredible. What did they take when you were little? Did your parents, either when they were together or even after they split up, did you go to a lot of things like shows or movies or anything?
No, not a lot.
Oh, wow.
It was more something you would do in my mom's household. It was more something you would do for, like, as a birthday present. We would get theater tickets to see something. And my dad, if a show was coming to town, like he took us to see A Chorus Line, he took us to see Annie, took us to see Fiddler on the Roof. So more that kind of touring show that would come through. He took us to see Marcel Marceau, the mime, but it was more of a special occasion thing. We weren't people who had season tickets or anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. Amazing.
Yeah.
And so since you say you've been thinking about this, and I think for many writers, it does tend to go back to family a lot. Like, how much do you think your childhood or thinking about, I think of Spielberg now has made this movie about his childhood. And I wonder how much of that, those experiences of having your parents split up or whatever their lives were, have influenced the kinds of things that you write about.
I think deeply, and I'm trying to open this new chapter now of thinking about that a little bit more personally, because so much of being a playwright is really constructing voices that are in dialogue with one another. So you don't pick one. You don't say, this is me and I'm going to write my story. And in fact, usually the plays I like don't have that sense that who's the real main character. I prefer a more split main character. And but I realized part of that is also a fear that no one is particularly interested in super domestic interior type work, especially from women. That work from women has to have a bit more of a like political armor, or you have to say why it's important with an I. So I'm kind of starting this excavation, like, why is my mother's life important? Why was her life important? Why was my father's life important, which I've thought about more. So there was something about the particular, where the particular time and place of being in California and the daughter of people who are not from California, living as they do kind of bi-coastally, like having, I don't live bi-coastally, I live in New York, but having a great comfort and roots on the West Coast. I was married to a woman, now I'm married to a man. So there's a sort of, I'm on the cusp of the zodiac. So I have a sort of kind of naturally like bifurcated way of looking at things. But yeah, I think there are burdens that our families carry that we inherit, whether we want them or not. And yeah, so I've been reading all about the Spielberg thing too. I think it's super fascinating.
Yeah, no, it is. And I feel like just your work, I feel like it feels like you've kind of done it indirectly in a certain amount of ways. And it's funny, as I was reading about you, to get ready for today, I started thinking about this old Mahalia Jackson song. I don't know if you know it. I'm gonna live the life I sing about in my songs. And I thought you sort of put a spin on that. You're sort of like, I'm gonna write the plays I've lived in some
Yeah,
ways.
I have not lived most of what I've written, thankfully.
Well, no,
Yes,
sure,
yes,
yeah.
yeah.
But some of it sort of, and I was thinking, when I came across this thing, oh, you had this long-term relationship with a woman for many years, and then you married a man, and then, the whole decision to have children and not to have children and all of these different things is so interesting. And then there's the whole Jewish thing sort of superimposed on there. This is the American Jewish Historical Society, but you've written some plays that have Jewish themes and certainly Jewish characters, but I don't think anybody would pigeonhole you as a Jewish writer, whatever that means per se. And so I think one thing that would be really interesting for people to hear about is just a little bit more about where these ideas come from, and how you turn those ideas into plays, because I think many people have at least the fantasy of being a writer or being a playwright or something like that, but the actual process of translating these random things in your head into work, how do you do that just as a practical matter? What's the process?
I wish I knew. I would do it the same way every time. Yeah. So I think every play is pretty different in its process. And it's true for some writers that every play is different. I think for me, it's particularly true. My plays are particularly different from one another. And so sometimes I get a kind of bug in my brain, which is usually a kind of anger, right? So for New Golden Age, I'd been sitting on a kind of Amazon hatred of Amazon, the company, for a while. And then I lived in Seattle for a few years, which was kind of an Amazon company town. And my Amazon hatingness got more specific. And then I learned about this activist law student, Lena Khan, who'd written about Amazon in such a way that she had actually written about monopoly law. She'd figured out how to implicate Amazon for being a monopoly in a way that it took 100 years. She had to go back 100 years in the law to find the legal route to that. And she found it as a graduate student. She's now federal trade commissioner. I mean, she rose this was in like just a few years. She was very quickly. But at this time, she was a law student, and Amazon came at her. And so suddenly it was like there was this idea of a person. You know what I mean? Like, so I guess it's this thing of I may have a political thing that I'm thinking about or reading about, and I don't even know why. And then somehow there has to be a face or a voice or a conflict. And so in the play, it's two sisters who have two points of view on the futuristic monopoly called Sunlight. So it's kind of like it has to be political and personal, and sort of when I can feel those things hit each other, then I feel like it's a real idea. I'm not a person who has, a million ideas. I have few ideas when that really count. And then sometimes something will come to me. I write adaptations, I write musical things. Something will come to me that's a book, or in the case of The Lucky Star, a group of letters. And then it's like I have to find where that hits me personally, because it kind of has to have both, because that's what a play is. So it has to have something that's really vital to me and that I feel can also meet the world in some important way. There's that word again, important. I don't know, at least in a vital way, in a relevant way.
Yeah. And when you're working on something, do you have somebody who you bounce the things off of, or do you do it all alone, or how does just even the actual process happen?
Yeah, I mean, both. I make a lot of note cards. I work with a writers group. We've been working together for, I've been part of the group since 2003, and I was a latecomer. So like I'm working on a new musical book, and I'm hearing it with my writers group tonight on Zoom. So we've been a little erratic in our meeting, but we're gonna get together and they're gonna hear my musical book, and their notes are some of the most important notes that I get. I share with friends. I share. Sometimes I read things when I want just love. I read things to my husband, Todd London, who is an activist and leader in the theater. But in our relationship, he never gives me notes, which is probably why we're still married. So I don't really go to him for feedback. I go to him for love. But I make note cards and I lay those out, and I have a kind of system that I teach where there's a linear strand that you lay out, and then there's all the things above and below that are part of the world that are part of it, but you don't know how they don't necessarily work as part of the beginning, middle, and end. So I do make a lot of notes, and I do a lot of reading usually. And yeah, sometimes I organize a lot and sometimes I organize less. So that part really varies. Yeah.
Wow, interesting. And then when would your work then go to something like a workshop phase? Does it have to be commissioned at that point, or like just how do you get it to the point where you can actually have actors or people reading it, or so you can see what it looks like? What is that? When does that even happen?
Yeah, so that's also super different. So some plays are commissioned, like The Lucky Star was commissioned by Chicago Shakespeare Theater. It was called The Book of Joseph. And every time I finished a draft, we would all go to Chicago, or I would go to Chicago, and they would gather a wonderful cast, and we would hear it out loud, sometimes for a day, sometimes for a week. And I think we did 7 workshops of that play before it was produced, but because it was commissioned, they developed it completely. So Barbara Gaines, who directed that first production, and Rick Boynton, who was really part of the producing and commissioning, they were the voices that came into that. I never sent it anywhere. Whereas like New Golden Age, which I had a Guggenheim to fund it, but it wasn't commissioned from anybody. But I was part of the Keene Theater Company had a mid-career playwrights lab that I was part of with Ken Urban and Lisa Ramirez, and we would get together and read whatever. So I read that play in sections with that group, and it was on Zoom, so it felt in between a public reading and a private reading. And then Primary Stages, which had been interested in another play of mine, took New Golden Age to a festival in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, right after the world started opening up, summer 2021. And so then I got to hear it out loud. That sounds like a lot of detail, but it's like, it could be so different. So it's like you hear it a bunch of places. Speaking of Jewish things, I have a play I wrote back in the day called Goliath that had 18 readings and no production.
Wow.
So it's like sometimes it's very easy to get the reading and you get a lot of that feedback and development, but then you don't get the production.
Right.
So I've been lucky, that's been rare, but yeah.
Yeah. And that's, well, it's so interesting. And that's why I do want to talk to you about it, because I think that, you know, part of it is these interviews go into the archive of HAHS. And I think the whole, you know, for people listening, I think the whole creative process is a mystery, even to those of us involved in it. It's kind of bizarre. And so it's always interesting to hear how other people do it. But I also think, you know, here in the United States, the arts fill such a funny place, right? I mean, it's not like in other countries where there's a national theater. I mean, I guess we do have the NEA, but I mean, it's just different. I think that there's not as much public support for the quote unquote serious arts or for drama, you know, and, you know, it's more commercial arts like TV or movies, you know, because that's something that gets paid for. And so I think this whole idea, I mean, you've been doing this for a long time, incredibly successfully around the country, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But, you know, this whole business side of the creative life is fascinating, you know, both the business, the actual work of doing it, and then the practical part of getting it done. And then, as my mother would say, how do you earn a living? You know, like it's that combination. So how does it work for somebody like you, who's a really successful artist, but you've worked primarily outside of New York, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. But you know, how do you keep the whole, you know, people who have regular jobs, you know, they deal with the same kinds of things. People have projects, some of them work out, some of them don't, but they get a salary. You know, I worked for many years as a journalist, and I had all kinds of stories, but you know, if one of them didn't pan out, I still got paid, you know? And so I was just wondering, how do you sustain the business side and the creative side and keep it real, you know, and so if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's also really different every year. And so when I started out, I kind of had in my head, I mean, this shows how old I am. So this was the early mid-90s, that I needed to earn $1,000 a month in order to, like, my rent was $280 and I had car insurance and I had this, and I walked through. It was like if I could clear $1,000 a month after taxes. And I just kind of figured out, so I had an admin job briefly at a theater, which didn't pay very well. And so I quit that. So I taught LSAT and SAT prep and that kind of thing. And then I started teaching playwriting in schools, and that stayed. So teaching has often stayed, has been a constant for me, more or less, as a way to even that out. So over the years, it's like that number has gone up of, you know, what's needed, but also my resources have changed. So to be honest, it's different to navigate as a married person, right? It's different because, and I've been married twice. So on both times I was married to people who worked in the nonprofit world. So it's not like I'm married into like great wealth, but there was more stability there. And so that's a privilege that changed. I mean, that changes it, that it changes the game somewhat. And to be honest, my mother passed away when I was in my late 40s and so I have like a little bit of resources that I didn't have before. And so, I mean, I'm speaking really candidly because all my life I was like, trust fund this, blah, 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 blah. and now I am also a person who has a different kind of insulation. So it's not, that's enabling me actually to take some more risks right now, even though there's maybe not a lot coming in. And now my husband has moved to being completely freelance as well. So I'm on Obamacare for the first time. You know, I'm paying for health insurance for myself and my son for the first time in a while. So it's like been different every year. And then I've broken into television just in the last couple of years. And so I wrote a TV pilot based on one of my plays, and I hope it will become a television show, but it did pay. So that helps as well. So it's kind of like every year is different. It's just that the numbers are much bigger than when I started. So it's a long answer, but I want to be real about it.
No, it's a great answer, and it's not too long, because I think it's important to, I think it both shows that, yeah, it's not easy, but it's also possible. And you just have to be creative, I guess, in the way, and a little lucky.
I guess it's like, it is possible, but it's not, I don't want to say it's equally possible for everybody. I don't think that's true. And also housing is really, really different. Like it's really different for people who are young now than when I was young. It was just more possible. And I do worry about that. And so I think it's more than being creative, though it is part of that. And the fact is, I mean, and I say this without bitterness or braggadocio, like I'm kind of excellent, and I've made like about as much money as like a seasoned high school teacher most years, you know, like, so you also have to be okay. You want your aspirations to be modest, you know, and I'm really, really lucky, but the money is small in the theater, and almost all playwrights now write for television. Like, so I'm again, just keeping it real. It's hard. It's hard.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, you know, just to continue on that vein, you know, you've had a hugely successful career as a playwright. You've had a gazillion plays produced in really great regional theaters. And yet this year was really the first year that you had this major New York presence. And I just wonder, is it still that important to have this New York thing on your, or is it more important maybe because this is where you live and it's more of a, not, I don't want to say ego, but just self, or is it also important professionally?
It remains very important professionally. Yeah. I mean, New York is still the professional center of this country. I mean, not the geographical center, it's still the professional center. So the opportunity to feel like I sort of caught up and to have those three works be presented, be seen by this society here, be seen by my peers here. I mean, I'm a New York artist. It wasn't just, I mean, yes, it was helpful to my ego and my self-esteem and my story about myself. It was really helpful. But it was also real, you know, and I got to work with extraordinary people, which not to say I haven't worked with extraordinary people across the country. But the density of talent here is unlike anywhere else. Yeah.
Amazing. And you're talking across the board, the actors, the production people, the
across
whole
the
thing.
board. Across the board, the stage management, the designers, across the directors, of course, yeah, the actors. I mean, I had 20 actors and 5 understudies in these shows, and I wouldn't have changed out one. You know, they were extraordinary. Stephanie Clapper did the casting for all 3 of them.
Amazing.
Yeah.
You know, I meant to ask you this as a follow-up before, and I forgot, and I just don't want to forget later. When you talked about, and it's relevant to the New York production too, and you go through these workshops and rehearsals, and you're sitting there and you're the writer, and I'm assuming you also sit with the director and the producer and a bunch of other people. So who gets who is there any hierarchy in terms of who can make suggestions about changes? And is that difficult for you as the writer, or is it helpful? Is it just like having a great editor?
It's not like having a great editor. Editors have a different prerogative than anyone does with the, and I'll just speak about the theater because TV and film are different. So yeah, like an editor really goes through with a pen and changes things. And I have never worked with anyone who has done that with my work. I've heard that it does, but that's not the norm. Yeah, directors make suggestions, definitely. I tend to see how directors like to work, and just as long as it's usually what works best is we make suggestions about each other's work in private rather than in front of all the actors. So if a director feels like a line doesn't work, they won't say that in front of the person who has to say the line. But if I feel like the blocking is weird, I also won't say that in front of the person who has to, because the actors have to carry it in their bodies. So it's better for them to get everything usually from the director. I think that I endeavor in my work to be as, I write characters of other races. I write across age and obviously across the gender spectrum. And so when I am writing across an identity point, I tend to solicit feedback from the actor a little more with more humility and openness, because I understand that person is naturally going to know things about the character that I don't know. So I'm always interested in knowing that from an actor, because they have to kind of steer their own ship of the character through the play. So anything that they're not making sense out of, or that they feel like they have to come up with some weird backstory in order to justify, I always like to know those things.
Interesting. So just following along, writing about characters from different backgrounds, and we talked a little bit about the fact that you have had a certain number of plays with Jewish characters in them, and I wonder just how do you see yourself? I mean, you're the granddaughter of Jewish immigrants. How do you see being Jewish, or do you have a Jewish identity? Is it something that's part, and if you do, what is it? I mean, what does it mean to you in terms of your place in the world?
Yeah, Julie, I'm on the board of my synagogue. Like, I have a Jewish identity for sure. I mean, it's a little weird that I'm on the board of my synagogue because I don't go to synagogue very often, but I'm a proud member of Park Slope Jewish Center. I have a kind of, it's sort of a strange Jewish identity, as I guess any kind of, no, I'm not going to summarize. So I do have a Jewish identity. It's historical, it's bodily. One of the most important books I read over the pandemic was called My Grandmother's Hands by, I think I'm pronouncing his name wrong, Resma Menachem, who's a Black writer based in Minneapolis, who wrote about ancestral trauma and kind of what we carry in our bodies. And he actually had a carve out for Jewish people among white people, which I found, which made sense to me, because his argument was kind of that Jewish people, we walk through our culture as white people with all of the privileges thereof, but to whatever degree memories are passed through the body, we don't have a memory of being on top of power, of overpowering, of being on the acting side of violence. Our ancestral memories are more likely to have been on the fleeing or the receiving side of violence. And so it can result in a sense of, if unexamined, a kind of weird sense of feeling like an underdog when you're not necessarily treated like an underdog. And so that book was one of those things that just, it was a paradigm shift for me to understand, some of what I'm carrying, because I've always written these heavy, heavy things, not always, But for all the time I've been writing, I've touched on things that are heavier than my own lived experience. And I connect that to Jewishness. I connect it to Jewish study. I connect it to Jewish ancestry. And I sometimes write Jewish characters and works, and sometimes I don't. And that just depends what comes my way and what I think, what ideas cross my mind. But I'm just now starting to think about anti-Semitism more. Like it hadn't been a big part of my self-awareness or thoughts about the world. Like, you know, for every 1,000 thoughts I've had about gender, I've had fewer than one thought about anti-Semitism in this lifetime, and that's changing somewhat. So that's a
why is that, do you think?
Because anti-Semitism has come into the open in our culture. And, you know, I grew up in the 70s and 80s. I really didn't see it. I had never seen a swastika like in the wild, like an actual swastika that someone put up until the Trump administration. So I actually didn't know that was here.
Yeah.
So I don't know how that resonates with your experience.
No, well, a lot. And I think part of it is that I think over the last 6 years, and it's a combination of social media and Trump's way of being, that I think a lot of things that were probably have always been there. You know, we all have bad thoughts about things, and we all have bad thoughts about other groups and our own group. But back in the day, like 7 years ago, you just kept them to yourself. And I think all of a sudden, Trump gave people license to say, and so, yeah, I think that's definitely increased in awareness and an ugliness, you know, that it's a big country. And so if 1 million people have really horrible things to say and thoughts, it's a lot of people. It's not a lot in percentage, but if they're all tweeting or they're all on social media, all of a sudden they have a bigger. So I totally, I agree with what you're saying. And it actually led me to something else I wanted to ask you about, because your husband, who's, I see why you give him your work for affirmation, because he did write this beautiful article, essay about you and your work, which was
he does write about playwrights. It's not just me.
No, but
he
it was
a thing called A Lover's Guide. Yeah.
No, I know. He said, I write about playwrights. And I thought, why can't I write about a playwright that I love, which I love. I thought that was really great. Everybody should Google it. I'm forgetting his first name. London is his
Todd London, name. Yeah.
Todd London. Google it. It's really beautiful. Todd London, put Karen Hartman, Todd London, it'll pop up. Anyhow, but one of the things he talked about, which I also loved, was Studs Terkel. And he was saying that Studs Terkel was a long time hero of yours. And now that you're talking about your feelings about Judaism, it kind of makes more sense that this champion of the underdog would be, or maybe that wasn't it. What was it about? How did you even find Studs Terkel?
So when I was in 8th grade and taking an acting class at the San Diego Junior Theater, an actor who's still an actor named Jimmy Saba was our teacher. He was like in 12th grade and he was teaching our class. And he had us do monologues from Working by Studs Terkel.
Wow.
I don't know if we got to choose them or if we were assigned them, but the way that Studs Terkel had of listening to people, interviewing them, capturing their voices, presenting people with so much dignity and so much particularity, so that you really feel the soul of someone else. I was a telephone operator. That's how I got introduced to Studs Terkel, and that was, you know, before playwriting, but that was the attraction, was inhabiting the voices of other people and understanding the voices, understanding other people, really.
Yeah.
Like that's our hardest job as human beings. And it's kind of the first requirement to be a playwright. So that's why it's so hard to write plays, among other reasons. So yeah, that's how, and I'm still a fan. I have a Studs Terkel book on hold at the library right now because I researched for this.
That's incredible. That's incredible. And that I think you know, you're making me think that if we had a national book that everybody had to read, maybe Studs Terkel would be the best thing. Cause I feel like, just following up with what you were saying before, is that people don't listen to each other. You know, we are, you know, you find out somebody's political orientation or they're this, and anyway, so
Yeah.
I'm getting a warning here that our time's almost up, which I'm really sad, but I do want a final word from you, but it can be more than one word. It can be a lot of words. So you've had a long, really interesting, really successful career with, you know, maybe not always exactly what you might have dreamed in your biggest moments, but probably a lot better than you could have ever imagined when you were 12 or whatever, starting out in this. So if you could give your young self some advice about this career that you were embarking on, what would that advice be? Not just in terms of managing the career, but really in how to maybe appreciate it.
I would tell my young self to think bigger. Yeah.
What do you mean by big?
I find that very, I don't know, a bit, I'm gonna cry and then we're gonna sign off. I guess I just, the idea of being an artist for a living was like the most incredible thing I could imagine. And that was always my goal. And I feel like in retrospect, like I could have had a bigger goal, you know? Yeah, I guess I would tell my young self to think bigger.
But what kind of bigger goal? What would that be?
Guess that okay, so maybe to be more persistent earlier, take good sign. This is not as concise as think bigger, but oh gosh, Julie, I don't know. I don't want to end by saying I don't know. It's just what comes to me instinctively that there's an opportunity when you're young to think about a landscape that's different from the landscape you're in, I guess, rather than to think about what place you might possibly hold in the landscape that you're in and think I could work. I mean, to work in the theater just seemed so incredible. But the theater's a mess, you know? And so it's like, what's under that goal? To communicate with people, to heal rifts between mothers and daughters, which is work that is that is way undone so far for me. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like, you set out really to heal the world, not to, that's the real goal. So I guess that's the bigger goal.
Yeah, but I would argue back at you that person by person in your work, that's kind of what you do. You know, I think that's person by person what the theater at its best, and you do serious theater. I don't mean serious like grumpy theater, but serious theater that is tackling big ideas. And I think that's pretty big. I think that's pretty big.
Thank you.
You know. So I really appreciate your coming today and talking so honestly and really helpfully about process, about your life. Thank you so much. And I look forward to see what you do next. I'll be looking for that TV series.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.